Well, today we're going to talk about a very specific model of Jeep from the early to mid 1980s, and that is the Jeep CJ8 Scrambler that you see here. Now, I thought I would pick this particular variant because many people know the standard CJ7 or the Jeep Wrangler, but the Scrambler, until recently when it was introduced, was something that was a bit lost to history, and that's because, as I mentioned, it was just produced from 1981 to 1986, and it really didn't sell all that well. Typically sold under 10,000 units per model year during that particular time frame. And I think another reason why many people forget about it is because Jeep, soon after the Scrambler's introduction, would introduce its Cherokee-based Comanche pickup, a unibody pickup. But this is not a unibody Jeep. This is kind of the good old-fashioned World War II style Jeep that had, let's say, tough, rugged underbody. And it certainly could go many places where other vehicles could not, owing to its excellent four-wheel drive system. Now, for a little bit of history of Jeep, of course, Jeep during this time frame was owned by American Motors Corporation. And this was really the reason why Chrysler ended up procuring American Motors in the late 1980s, and that was because they wanted Jeep. They didn't really have anything else in the portfolio that was of need or want. The Renault-based vehicles just were not something that Chrysler was really going after. But Jeep was a coveted brand and had been for a number of years. The interesting thing, though, for those who don't know, Jeep arguably was the purchase back in 1970 that really set American Motors on a teeter-totter when it came to financials. The company had levered up significantly, taken on quite a bit of debt when it acquired Jeep in 1970, and the interest expense on that debt was something that really burdened the company from a cash flow perspective and precluded their ability to invest in additional products. That really, coupled with the fact that they went from being the small car producer to a car company that was trying to compete with the big three. In fact, some of their advertisements played this up, said, what would you do if you had to compete with the big three? That it really just stretched the company's resources. They imagined just had to really originally focus on small vehicles and devote all their capital toward that. And then as they expanded into more and more vehicle lines and more areas of the various car segments, they had to deploy increased amounts of capital. And I think it just proved a bit too much for the company, such that they had to take out a partner in the early 1980s, Renault. And then, well, that just didn't go well. Some of you know the history of the Renault alliance. Maybe that's a topic for another video. Long story short, they formed a partnership with Renault, thought that Renault was going to provide them with cars that were, let's say, relevant for the times, small, compact, lightweight, everything that Americans wanted. And while the cars, at least initially, were quite successful, won Motor Trend Car of the Year in some cases, and drove quite well, they just were not all that reliable, unfortunately. And I think that was really the nail in the coffin for American Motors. So around this time that AMC is kind of having financial troubles, they launched the Jeep Scrambler. And they're trying to get a little bit creative during this time frame. You have to give AMC product planners credit because in 1980, they came out with the American Motors Eagle, which was effectively a Hornet from 1973 that was raised and had a four-wheel drive system underneath it. And they created almost a new market segment, the crossover segment. One could debate, Subaru had other vehicles like that, but American Motors certainly made its mark in, let's say, hastening the public's acceptance of crossovers with that AMC Eagle's introduction in 1980, and they did so for very little cost. It was a Hornet, like I said, with a four-wheel drive system attached to it in effect. Of course, some other modifications. But AMC before that had really refreshed the Hornet in 1978 as the Concorde and tried to kick it up market. People often thought of compact cars as cheap, efficient, and kind of, let's say, pedestrian forms of transportation. But the Concorde had a number of luxury features, very deluxe seating, deluxe carpets, and you didn't feel like you were in the penalty box when you drove one. But I will say AMC didn't have enough capital to change as much sheet metal as they wanted in the early years. If you look at the 78 Concorde, you'll notice that it has single headlamps on either side, and it has really the rear associated with the previous Hornet. And then in 1979, it gets a new front end. In 1980, it gets a new rear end. I think they had to do that because they just didn't have enough money. So AMC was trying to do so much with so little by this point in time to get into new market segments and invent products that could give it incremental sales and do so with little capital. Of course, as I mentioned, it failed because they take on Renault as a partner. But I think the Jeep Scrambler was one of the innovations that came out of that, because the Scrambler was a vehicle that you basically just take a Jeep on an elongated 103-inch wheelbase, and you terminate the cab aft of the driver and passenger seat and put a pickup body at it. And heck, you've got a whole new vehicle for the pickup market segment, which was something that Jeep had participated in historically with vehicles like the J10. But you got a different kind of spin on that pickup market segment here. Now, as I mentioned, the Scrambler was built atop a 103.5-inch wheelbase. It was about 10 inches longer than the regular CJ7s, which, by the way, were over 10 inches longer than the CJ5s. So Jeeps just kept getting bigger and bigger and longer and longer. 103-inch wheelbase is not a very large wheelbase for a car at all. In fact, the footprint of a Scrambler that you see here is about equivalent to a modern-day Honda Civic. It's a pretty small vehicle overall. But I think the wheelbase was certainly needed so that it had a functional bed in the back. And it was a great idea. I mean, Jeep just kind of stretched the wheelbase a little bit, used the same suspension and engine and transmission, and the same front doors, the same hood, the same windshield, the same glass. And they basically just had to put a roof over the cab and terminate it, put a roll bar, because you have to have a structural component, just like the other Jeeps, the CJ7 had, to ensure that it could be sturdy enough in the event of a rollover, and voila, you've got a whole new vehicle. Now, up front, the Scrambler certainly bore the original Jeep traits, those kind of bug-eyed headlamps with the parking lamps or turn signal indicators underneath them, the 7-slot grille that dated all the way back to the days when Jeeps were started by Willis. And then that kind of evolved into the Kaiser Jeep Corporation, into AMC, etc. Now, the front end, like I said, was trademark Jeep, although I will put an interesting little tidbit of trivia here. When General Motors released the Hummer lineup, the H2 is an example, the H3, back in the early 2000s, they got sued by Jeep because of the 7-slot grille. And Jeep kind of claimed that that was their trademark and Hummer was infringing on it, and they lost the case. But I did notice that the new Hummer EV does not have the same 7-slot grille that the previous Hummers did. So I guess Jeep kind of tried to claim that. Similar to how BMW actually did try to sue Pontiac over the twin-port grille that Pontiac had, because BMW had their dual kidney grills. But they also did not prevail in that case. One other little interesting tidbit about the design here: there's no curved side glass in Jeeps. You just have glass that goes straight up and down. So that's a cost savings move. And somehow, I'm not sure why, but AMC decided to use different style door handles on their CJ-based vehicles. These larger door handles, as opposed to the typical AMC ones that had the same form, but these were larger. And I guess they felt that if you were a Jeep owner, you wanted to activate this with your entire hand as opposed to a few fingers. But I think this is the only vehicles in which they used these exterior latches, because everybody will recognize the other typical AMC door latch, and even they use that as the tailgate latch on the Jeep J10 pickups as well. And you got a decent-sized pickup truck style bed here, although a significant fraction of the bed was effectively the roll cage. You can see here that took up a large fraction, and the wheel wells and the intrusion from the wheel wells. So I don't know how effective it was as a pickup bed, but you could certainly lug a few things around there. And I have to say, the vehicle looked pretty cool. So, you look good. You had something that was stylish. And I have to imagine that the vehicle, in terms of the passenger compartment, was also quieter given the more rigid cab style than basically a CJ7. So it probably was a little bit more refined vehicle overall, although there was not much sound deadening in these at all. Now, as we turn to the interior, while it didn't have all that much sound deadening, it wasn't that bad of a place to be. You did get comfortable bucket seats that had some nice kind of designs in them. And you didn't have much in terms of an aesthetically pleasing dashboard, just a few basic gauges to help you understand how your Jeep was operating. Now, the dash was so basic, in fact, that Jeep had to concoct this IP panel, effectively a crash pad, that was literally just that. Normally, the instrument clusters and the crash pad are integrated into one overall form. But here you have the gauges below that are inset into this metal panel, and you have the crash pad on top, and that's really the only function that it serves. You also notice this particular vehicle has air conditioning, and it's almost like a bolt-on AC. And a lot of the Jeeps of this era have something similar to this for factory air that it looks like it's just kind of an afterthought. And I think that was for ease of production, and that was how American Motors really did most of this. They had the air conditioning separate from some of the other HVAC components. And you can see a little bit more of that in this particular picture. At least you got the Jeep logo that was embossed on the passenger side. You'll also notice the crank window handles that were ubiquitous on AMC style products. So AMC was really good at reusing components and being inventive, and I think they really did that because they had to. I mentioned they didn't have much money, and they just had to roll with what they had. Now, this particular Jeep Scrambler is outfitted with AMC's, I would say, frequently used 258 cubic inch inline six-cylinder engine. Now, obviously, the individual who owns this has replaced the carburetor with an aftermarket carburetor, probably because the Carter carburetor that came on these was okay, I would say. The idle jets tended to clog. It did have electronic feedback controls in a number of years. It looks like, if my eye is correct, that this has actually been replaced with a Motorcraft two-barrel carburetor, which I have to say would be an excellent carburetor, and I'm guessing that based on the external accelerator pump that you can see there. In any case, these 258 cubic inch engines were really, really reliable, really well done. The only thing I would say is I think some of these, certainly in the Eagles and the cars, you have to watch out for the valve cover because on a number of model years, they're plastic and they warp and then they leak. The valve cover was made by AMC's own division, Creighton, that also made the fender flares for Eagle. And, well, what happens is the valve cover starts to leak, and as opposed to replacing the gasket, people try to tighten them a little bit more, and then they end up over-tightening them. This one, I do not think this is a plastic valve cover on here, just based on its looks. Also, you can notice the GM Saginaw steering pump. At this point, a lot of AMCs had the GM Saginaw steering. They had, for the alternator, a Delco alternator. They had Ford Motorcraft wiring. So American Motors really was all makes combined during this time frame, but they did produce their own engines, and they really were great engines. American Motors, to my knowledge, never produced their own automatic transmission. They always bought them. Typically during this time frame, Chrysler Torque Flights, which were excellent transmissions, and there really was no reason for AMC, given its scale, to engineer and make its own when they could just procure them on their own. So what do you think of the Jeep Scrambler? Was this a pretty innovative product idea that AMC could come up with for not much money? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.